If this is your first time encountering the heartwarming everyday stories I tell, I'd like to invite you before we begin to take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, not to increase the number of subscribers, but because I believe that every kind story we share will reach someone who needs it. And who knows, today might be the day you need to hear this story. This is the story of a black man who was once the CEO of a tech company, but was forced to leave his position due to years of internal discrimination. A man who rose to the top and then fell but never lost his compassion. And one night, in heavy rain, a small decision opened up, seemingly impossible possibilities. But before we get to those things, I want you to imagine an ordinary morning in a small café located on the corner of Maple Street in Cresthill. Warm, golden light streamed through the large glass windows. The low hum of the coffee grinder filled the air, the aroma of espresso warming the customers who had just escaped the chilly morning wind. Inside the café, a woman with neatly tied-up brown hair named Grace Turner busily coordinated the morning shift. She checked orders, adjusted the POS machine, changed the coffee machine filter, and then turned to help the barista fix a recently spilled latte. Her face looked slightly tired, but her eyes were focused, meticulous, and patient. Grace is the kind of person you can tell after just a few minutes is the one running the shop. A woman who does more than her job, tries harder than she's paid, and always smiles to make things look better than they actually are. Regular customers love coming during her shift because everything runs smoothly, quickly, and genuinely. But this morning was unlike any other day. At approximately 8:10 a.m., the cafe door burst open more forcefully than usual, and a tall, imposing man in an expensive suit with a cold expression walked in. Caleb Monroe, the regional supervisor of the Maple and Shore Cafe chain, the man every store manager wanted to avoid. Caleb disliked delays, mistakes, and people who didn't meet his expectations, and few ever did. Grace immediately recognized Caleb walking in. She paused for half a second, trying to hide her anxiety, and approached the door. "Good morning, Mr. Monroe. I didn't know you were visiting today." Caleb waved his hand dismissively. "I don't need you to know. I'm here because this area has reported slower than standard service speeds. And according to the system, this store is a weak point." The atmosphere in the cafe suddenly became tense. Several customers exchanged puzzled glances. A young barista dropped a stainless steel spoon because his hand was shaking. Grace tried to keep her voice steady. "The POS system is still," Caleb interrupted. "You're always making excuses. Do you know what I hate most? Seeing a store run in disarray and then hearing a manager constantly blaming the equipment." His voice was louder than necessary. His words were sharp as a knife. The guests sitting nearby turned their heads awkwardly. Grace swallowed hard, her hands clasped together. "I'm sorry. I'll try. You don't just need to try. You have to take responsibility," Caleb said slowly, his voice cold. "And I don't see that responsibility." Then he uttered the decisive words like a hammer blow to the ground. "She is suspended, effective immediately." The sound of a spoon falling to the floor echoed again. A petite female employee covered her mouth in shock. Grace stood motionless as if all her strength had been drained away. Her shoulders trembled slightly, but she tried not to burst into tears in front of everyone. Caleb turned around, speaking in a final voice that seemed to extinguish all hope. "You should thank me for not firing you. Start packing." Grace looked down at the wooden table still smelling of coffee where she had worked for over 3 years, her old apron, the scratched wall clock. The corner of the cafe she had cleaned countless times. Everything suddenly seemed unfamiliar. At that moment, there was only one person in the cafe who couldn't take their eyes off Grace. A tall, dark-skinned man with deep, calm eyes sat at a table near the window, not yet having taken a sip from his steaming Americano. His name is Elijah Warren. He wasn't an employee of the cafe nor a regular customer, just a casual visitor this morning. But his eyes that had witnessed so much discrimination, so much injustice, so many times he had been overlooked, despite his talent and hard work, were gazing intently at the scene. He understood Grace's feelings perfectly. The feeling of being publicly humiliated, the feeling of being treated as invisible, the feeling of having your position taken away with just one cold remark. In Elijah's eyes there was a mixture of poignant silence and an unnameable sadness. He didn't jump in to intervene, not because he was a coward, but because he understood that sometimes intervening at the wrong time would only hurt the person who was already suffering even more. But There was something about Grace that made it impossible for him to take his eyes off her. It feels like this story isn't over yet. A gut feeling told me this morning is just the beginning. The sound of coffee dripping from the coffee maker was a steady murmur. Outside, the sky suddenly turned gray, signaling an impending rainstorm. The light dimmed, casting a soft shadow on Grace's face as she tried to suppress her emotions. Elijah let out a soft sigh, a very gentle breath like the first pause in a long piece of music. He didn't know that just 24 hours earlier he had met someone who would change the entire course of events. And he didn't know that the very kindness he had sown that rainy night would become the key to unlocking justice for a stranger, a woman standing right in front of him. The rain outside began to fall, lightly, but enough to remind him. It all started on a rainy night. That morning, after leaving Maple and Shore Café, Elijah walked slowly along the damp sidewalk. The light drizzle had stopped, but the pavement still bore streaks of water that hadn't yet dried. Passing cars splashed up tiny droplets of water sparkling in the weak sunlight. He tucked his hands into his coat pockets, took a deep breath, letting the aroma of coffee from the cafe mingle with the cool morning air. Despite trying to remain calm while witnessing Grace's humiliation, a familiar feeling welled up inside him, the sense of injustice he had endured for half his life. Elijah Warren. A name that has appeared in the young entrepreneur sections of many major business newspapers in the United States. A name that has been mentioned in the technology world as a prime example of perseverance and intelligence. And it's also a name many have deliberately forgotten simply because Elijah is a black CEO in an industry where the number of people like him can be counted on the fingers of one hand. He recalled that time, when people still called him Mr. Warren, with a mixture of respect and curiosity. When every morning he walked into the office in a sharp suit, his eyes bright, and his hands never trembled, even though the decisions he made could change the future of the company. But life doesn't measure a person's character by talent, it measures it by prejudice. Elijah developed a technology platform that helps bridge the gap between small businesses and large systems, an idea considered groundbreaking. But from the very first day of fundraising, he noticed frowns and scrutinizing glances. Are you sure you can lead a large team? Do you have real experience, or are you just a good storyteller? We believe in the product, but the leadership don't. Of course, they didn't say it directly. No one explicitly stated the reason, but Elijah knew perfectly well. He had smiled, shrugged, and tried to appear strong, but deep in his heart there was a wound that would never heal. Once, during an internal meeting, a major shareholder said in front of many people, "This company needs a leader with a more appealing image to investors." Everyone understood what that sentence meant. Only Elijah breathed steadily and replied, "I don't care about the image. I care about the result." But sometimes even the outcome can't save a person when others continue to view them through the lens of prejudice. Ultimately, a closed-door meeting changed everything. A group of shareholders proposed a leadership restructuring. The wording was formal, but in essence it was about removing Elijah from the very company he had built. They told him he should take a break, take a mentoring role, or find a more suitable path. That's how people tell you to quit without making themselves look bad. Elijah left the company that day. No argument. No resistance. Just a nod, a grab of his old laptop, and a heavy sigh as he walked out of the building. That image became a landmark in his life, a deep wound, but one that didn't bleed. A memory he didn't want to recall, yet it always found its way back whenever he witnessed injustice like this morning. At lunchtime, Elijah came to school to pick up Lily. She ran out with her little backpack and a radiant smile. "Daddy, I got a gold star sticker today. Really, I knew it. Lily always tries her best." He bent down and picked up his child, as was his habit, feeling the tiny warmth that he always considered the greatest source of strength in his life. The gentle scent of baby shampoo on his child's hair calmed his heart. The father and daughter stopped by the small supermarket near their home. The shelves were neatly arranged. Elijah picked some vegetables, a little chicken, a few gallons of milk, and a bottle of apple juice because Lily liked it. The little girl trotted beside him, occasionally tiptoeing to grab an item and handing it to him like a tiny, enthusiastic assistant. As Elijah loaded his items onto the checkout conveyor belt, he gazed at the pile of goods before him and silently did some mental calculations. Recent bills had consistently been higher than in previous months. Prices were rising, rent was piling up, but his income had plummeted since leaving his previous job. He didn't want Lily to see the worry on his face, so he tried to keep his voice cheerful whenever he spoke. There are moments like that, small but painful. But it is also these moments that remind Elijah that he no longer lives for himself. He has to stand firm. He can't let anyone or any injustice bring him down again. That afternoon, as Elijah dropped Lily off at home, he stopped the car in front of the small apartment building where they had lived for over a year. Before going inside, Lily pulled his hand back. "Daddy, why do you look so sad?" Elijah paused. Lily was always more perceptive than he thought. He smiled and sat down at eye level with his daughter. "Daddy isn't sad. He's just thinking a little. About what happened this morning, right? I saw Daddy staring into the distance in the car." Elijah was surprised. Sometimes he forgot that children see and feel things very clearly. He gently stroked his child's head. "Yeah, Daddy saw someone being treated unfairly. It reminded Daddy of a few things. Like when Daddy left his old company," Lily whispered. Elijah's heart sank, his little boy so tiny yet so understanding. "Yes. Something like that," he replied, his voice lower. Lily took his hand. It was small but warm. "Daddy taught me that even if people treat you badly, you should still be kind. I think Grace Turner this morning. She needed a kind person by her side." Elijah gazed deep into his daughter's eyes. There, he saw the reflection of his late wife, the woman who had once believed Elijah was born to do the right thing. And Elijah knew he couldn't stay out of this story. That evening, after Lily had fallen asleep, Elijah sat alone in the living room, the soft yellow light of the table lamp illuminating his face. On the table sat a cup of hot tea, steam rising in a thin wisp. He opened his laptop and looked at the emails about the unfinished consulting work. But his mind wasn't on them. It kept returning to Maple and Shore Café, to Grace's disappointed look when she was suspended, to Caleb's smug expression, to the helpless silence of the staff and customers. But in all those images, there was one thing he could never forget. The moment Grace tried to hold back her tears but couldn't stop her hands from trembling slightly. A woman who had endured too much in silence. A woman who had once resembled him so strangely. Elijah leaned back in his chair. A stream of thoughts suddenly flowed through him, gentle yet heavy with meaning. Perhaps I shouldn't ignore it. And in the silence of the room, the sound of rain falling outside the window reminded him that it all began on a rainy night. One night he helped a lost old man named Harold Bishop, without knowing that the man would return to his life just one day later. But that is a story for the next part. The next morning, Elijah Warren woke up before the sun had fully risen in Cresthill. The clock on the wall showed 6, 1, 2. The steady ticking of the second hand echoed in the small apartment, mingled with the gentle hum of the air conditioner blowing through the crack in the door. Elijah sat up, his feet touching the cool wooden floor. It was an ordinary morning, but his mind was heavy with more thoughts than usual. He walked past his daughter's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for him to see Lily clutching her caramel-colored teddy bear. Her hair was disheveled on the pillow, her breathing even and peaceful, so serene that Elijah's heart softened. Moments like these always helped him get through the hardest days. He adjusted the blanket for his child, then went into the kitchen. The small kitchen was only about 8 square feet, but everything was clean and tidy. On a wooden shelf hung a small photograph, a picture of his wife, the woman he had loved since college. She smiled in the photo, her gentle eyes seemingly embracing Elijah's whole world. He gently touched the corner of the picture frame. "Good morning, Emma." The longing for Emma no longer hurts as it did in the beginning, but it still lingers. Like an old wound, a mere touch makes his heart tremble. Elijah prepared breakfast. He beat eggs in a ceramic bowl, added a few slices of bacon and some butter to the pan. The sizzling sound of the butter hitting the hot pan filled the air, and the aroma was intoxicating. He brewed a cup of black coffee, the medium roast kind he'd been drinking since his days as CEO. A flavor that reminded him that even as life changed, there were things he wanted to keep the same. At around 6:40, Lily emerged from her room, her hair slightly disheveled, her eyes squinting but her face radiant. "Daddy, breakfast smells so good." "Good morning, sunshine," Elijah smiled, pulling up a chair for his son. The father and daughter ate breakfast in peace. Elijah told Lily a few short stories, asked about her schoolwork, and made sure she hadn't forgotten her crayon box. But Lily still keenly noticed his distraction. "Daddy, yesterday you were thinking about that girl named Grace, right?" Elijah paused for half a second. Even if he tried to hide it, Lily could sense it. "Yeah, Daddy just thought, I wish someone would step up and help her." Lily rested her chin on her hand, her eyes wide open. So, Daddy can't help. A simple statement, yet it shone like a ray of light into the darkest corner of Elijah's heart. Help, should he, a man who once lost everything because of injustice, turn back and confront it once again? He looked down at his hands. Long, strong lines, but also full of old calluses from the days he had to do manual labor after leaving the company. Life had knocked him down, but it had never extinguished the most important thing, self-respect. Elijah smiled faintly at his son, but didn't answer. Part of him was still hesitant. Not because he was afraid of Caleb Monroe, but because he was afraid of returning to the feelings he had struggled so hard to overcome. After dropping Lily off at school, Elijah drove his old sedan to Cresthill Ridge Park. He often stopped there whenever he needed to think. The park wasn't large, but it had a bench overlooking a lake that spanned more than 2 acres. In the early morning, the lake's surface was as still as a mirror, reflecting the blocks away and the clear blue sky. He sat down, his hands in his coat pockets, his gaze fixed on the water. Memories of his past career suddenly flooded back, subtly, but enough to leave him speechless. The day he first walked into the company as the youngest CEO in its history, the employees looked at him with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. No one said anything, but Elijah knew they were wondering, can a black man really lead us? Elijah proved it with his own hands, acquiring partners, securing funding, building core technology, keeping the team through burnout, and transforming a small garage into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. But success wasn't enough to erase that skeptical gaze. Elijah lost the company not because it failed, but because of people who wanted a more acceptable image in the eyes of the market. It was a harsh truth, but Elijah couldn't change it. He could only walk away. A cold wind swept across his face, bringing Elijah back to reality. He looked out at the lake where a few ducks swam gently along the rippling water. He wondered, had he truly moved on from the past, or did it still linger somewhere, causing his heart to ache every time he witnessed injustice? His phone rang. Message from an unknown number. Hello, it's me, the old man from the rainy night. If you have time, I'd like to meet you to thank you. Elijah stared at the words for a long time. Harold Bishop. The man he met on that rainy night. The man he didn't hesitate to take back to the nursing home because he couldn't leave him alone. A stranger, but there was something in his eyes at that moment that bothered Elijah. Perhaps meeting him again wouldn't be so bad. Perhaps life is trying to tell him something. He replied simply, I'm free this afternoon. Where would you like to meet? A moment later, Harold responded, Maple and Shore Café. Elijah frowned. Why the exact same place where yesterday's incident occurred? He stood gazing at the lake for a while longer. A feeling of unease crept into his chest, but it wasn't fear. It was more like the feeling you get when you know you're about to face something bigger than yourself. This may not be a coincidence. Perhaps this is the first step in something Elijah hasn't fully seen yet. That afternoon, Elijah arrived at Maple and Shore Café on time. The cafe was as crowded as ever. Sunlight streamed through the glass windows onto the wooden tables. The aroma of freshly roasted coffee filled the air, mingling with the chatter of the customers. And right at the table near the window, the same table he'd sat at yesterday, there was a familiar figure, Harold Bishop. Today he was wearing a gray wool coat, his silver hair neatly combed. His face was rosier than when they met in the torrential rain. Elijah approached, and Harold looked up and smiled faintly. Hello, Elijah Warren. I still remember your name. His voice was deep and warm, not trembling like the night before. Elijah sat down. Are you feeling better? I'm fine. Thanks, Harold replied. But I didn't just ask you to say thank you. His gaze suddenly turned serious, as if he knew something Elijah didn't. You saw what happened to Grace Turner yesterday, didn't you? Harold asked. Elijah was slightly startled. You know her. Harold looked deep into his eyes. Even more than that. Elijah sensed something was slowly unfolding. A thin veil, an unspoken secret, a connection between the rainy night and the unjust morning. Perhaps, Harold said slowly, you should know the real reason why I came to see you today. And the story began to take a turn that Elijah could not have foreseen. Harold Bishop gazed at Elijah for a long time, as if carefully considering each word before saying something important. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating his face and highlighting the wrinkles, not wrinkles of old age, but of years filled with thought and responsibility. Elijah remained silent. He sensed the atmosphere changing, thick, serious, as if something was about to be revealed. Harold folded his arms and leaned slightly forward. Elijah, I want you to understand one thing. Our meeting that rainy night wasn't entirely coincidental as you think. Elijah frowned. What do you mean I just happened to be passing by? Harold smiled faintly, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was more like an acknowledgement. You happened to be passing by. But I didn't, he said. I was there because I was looking for someone. Elijah sat up straight, his eyes fixed on Harold. Looking for me, Harold nodded very slowly. Yes. A gentle breeze swept through the window pane, rustling the leaves. The café was so still that Elijah could hear the sound of a spoon stirring a cappuccino at the next table. I know about you, Elijah, Harold said, his voice lowering. I know you used to be CEO of Horizon Tech. I know you lost that position because of discrimination. I know you rebuilt your life raising your daughter alone. And I know you have extraordinary inner strength. Elijah couldn't hide his surprise. Sin, you know all of that, yes. But how Harold placed his hand on the table, his gaze piercing through him. Because I'm not just an old man who got lost in the rain. Elijah felt his heart rate slow down by a beat. Harold took a deep breath. I used to be the chairman of the board of a diversified conglomerate. I retired 2 years ago, handing over the reins to someone else. But before I left, I entrusted some smaller businesses within the system to people I trust. Elijah still didn't understand, but Harold was about to say something that would start putting all the pieces together. One of those businesses, Harold said, emphasizing each word, is Maple and Shore Café. Elijah's eyes widened. Are you the real owner of this place? Harold nodded. Or at least one of the people with the highest decision-making authority. Elijah leaned back in his chair, unable to hide his shock. So, what happened to Grace Turner yesterday? Harold nodded again, but this time his eyes were heavy with emotion. I've heard about Caleb Monroe for a long time. I knew he wasn't kind, but I never thought it would be this serious. Yesterday I received a report that he suspended an employee without justifiable reason, an employee who was highly regarded by everyone. Elijah nodded slightly. Grace is doing a great job. I saw that, even though I only observed her for one morning. Harold narrowed his eyes, looking at Elijah as if trying to gauge his worth. And that's why I wanted to meet you, Elijah. He blinked. Why me? Harold said slowly. Because you saw the injustice, and you didn't turn your back. Even though you've suffered a lot, you still retain your compassion. I need someone like that. Elijah fell silent for a few seconds. Every word Harold spoke struck the deepest parts of his heart. The places where he kept his professional pain, his disappointment with people, and the weariness of having to pick himself up again and again. If you need someone to help Grace, Elijah said softly, I'm not sure I'm suitable. I'm just a failure. Harold shook his head. No, Elijah, you didn't fail. You were just treated wrongly. Elijah turned his face to the window, watching the people walking by. Part of him wanted to believe Harold's words. Another part was afraid to confront the past he wanted to bury deep. Do you remember that rainy night? Harold asked. Remember. Do you know why I opened up to you the moment you stopped your car? Elijah shook his head. Because your eyes held no suspicion, Harold said. No judgment. No judging me by my soaking wet suit or my gray hair. You simply saw a man in need of help. He looked at Elijah for a long time. And people like you, Elijah, are rare. The atmosphere warmed up as if Harold were laying a brick in the place where his heart had long lacked trust. But then Harold leaned forward, his voice lower, as if preparing to say something far more important. Elijah, I want you to help me uncover what happened to Grace Turner. I want to know what's really going on behind the doors that Caleb controls. Elijah felt his heart tighten again. You mean, investigate him? Harold nodded. I'm old now, Elijah. I'm not the one who needs to confront Caleb. You have vision, composure, the intuition of a former leader, and you have a heart. Elijah fell silent. His breathing slowed considerably as if he were listening to his own life knocking on the door once again. Helping Grace, facing a tyrant like Caleb, getting into new trouble, and potentially being dragged back into old wounds. Elijah looked down at his hands. They trembled slightly, not from fear but from a hesitation pulling them in 2 different directions. What if I say no? Elijah asked. Harold smiled kindly. I still thank you for that rainy night. And your life will go on as usual, but Grace will lose her job. Many other employees will continue to be oppressed. Caleb will become increasingly powerful. Elijah closed his eyes. The image of Grace bowing her head, her shoulders trembling slightly as she was suspended, the disappointed faces of the young employees, the smug look in Caleb Monroe's eyes. It all came back to life like a film reel, being rewound. Harold whispered, "But if you say yes, I'll be behind you, and Grace will have a chance to be saved." A long silence fell between them. At that moment, Elijah felt he was standing at a crossroads. A crossroads exactly like the one when he lost his company. Only this time he could change someone else's fate. Finally, he opened his eyes. His gaze was more resolute than before. "Okay," Elijah said, his voice low and clear. "I'll help." Harold smiled a smile of relief. "I knew you'd say that." Elijah breathed a sigh of relief, but then he suddenly remembered something important. "But," he said, "he asked me to meet him here for something else. What is it that I should know?" Harold took a sip of coffee, set the cup down on the table, and then spoke in a voice even lower than before Elijah. "Grace Turner is not just an excellent employee." Elijah waited. Harold looked him straight in the eye. "She is the daughter of my best friend in life." Elijah stopped. "It's all no longer a coincidence." The moment Harold Bishop acknowledged Grace Turner as the daughter of his best friend Elijah Warren, felt as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted an inch. Not much, but enough to make him feel his world tilt in a different direction. He stared at Harold for a long time, partly because he was so surprised, partly because all the pieces of the story suddenly fit together so perfectly. "Elijah," Harold said, his voice softening, "I promised her father I would keep an eye on Grace. But I'm old, I'm not always there, and Caleb Monroe took advantage of my inattention." Elijah let out a long sigh, looking out the window. The late afternoon sun shone down on the street, carrying with it a layer of golden dust suspended in the air. Customers passed through the door, the bells jingling steadily, but inside Elijah a wave was rising. "He wants me to help," Grace, Elijah repeated. "Not just Grace," Harold corrected, "but you. I see in you something I haven't seen in young people for years, unwavering determination." Elijah pursed his lips. He once had that unwavering resolve. But after the incident at Horizon Tech, that resolve was silently bent. Part of him wanted to stand up against injustice. Part of him was afraid of being drawn back into a fight he would lose because of his skin color. Harold looked at Elijah as if he could read his mind. "Elijah, you must understand that there are times when life puts you in situations not to test your strength, but to remind you that you were born to change something." Elijah gently closed his eyes. Change. He once wanted to change the world of technology. He once wanted to create more equal opportunities for young people of color. But the world turned its back on him. Now, the world is knocking on his door again, in the form of an old man in the rain and a woman being fired in front of him. "What do you want me to do?" Elijah asked. Harold straightened his back, his eyes serious. "I want you to observe Caleb. Find out the root of why he wants to get rid of Grace. I want you to use your leadership skills, the acumen you once used to lead an entire company, to protect the one who deserves it." Then Harold added another sentence powerful enough to leave Elijah speechless. "And I want you to replace Caleb if necessary." The atmosphere seemed to freeze. It took Elijah a few seconds to breathe normally again. "Replace him?" Elijah asked again, almost in disbelief. Harold nodded slightly. "You have the potential, and even though you no longer think of yourself as CEO, I can clearly see that you still have that quality." Elijah turned his face toward the fading light of the evening sky. A feeling of both responsibility and pressure weighed heavily on his shoulders, but amidst the chaos, a tiny flame, long dormant, suddenly flickered. After leaving the bar, Elijah walked slowly down the sidewalk. The afternoon sky in Cresthill was a soft orange, so beautiful that he wanted to stop for a few minutes just to breathe. But his mind was restless. Harold's words still echoed in his head. Replace Caleb. Protect Grace. Investigate the truth. Elijah had never run away from challenges, but this time it wasn't just a challenge. It was also about confronting a dark part of himself. The fear of discrimination, the fear of exclusion, the fear of being underestimated again. He arrived at the parking lot and opened the door of his old sedan. As he placed his hands on the steering wheel, memories from Horizon Tech swept through him like a cold wind. He remembered the last meeting. He remembered the cold stares of the shareholders. He remembered the words the chairman slammed on the table. "You're too emotional, Elijah. The company needs someone with a more traditional appearance." Traditional appearance. He would never forget those two words. These are the ways people say that he's not clean enough to represent the company. Those words didn't just strike at his career. They struck at his heart at the years he spent trying to prove himself, with blood and sweat. Elijah sat in the car for so long that the system automatically activated a battery-saving warning. He looked in the rearview mirror. A black man, a lingering occupational wound, a heart still strong enough to love his daughter, and perhaps strong enough to stand up and help someone else. He took a deep breath. "For Lily," he whispered, "for Grace, and for myself." The next day, Elijah returned to Maple and Shore Café, not to drink coffee, but to observe. Inside the bar, Caleb Monroe still appeared like a storm the moment he entered. The whole space felt heavy. "This needs to be cleaner. Why is this order taking 4 minutes? Did you change shifts on time? I don't want any more delays." The staff exchanged terrified glances. A young, inexperienced barista was so nervous she spilled a mocha, but Caleb just stood there, arms crossed, mercilessly criticizing her. Elijah sat at a table in the corner. He drank his Americano, but his eyes never left Caleb. Caleb had power. But it was the power of someone who had been given it, not someone who deserved it. And he could see one thing clearly: Caleb was hiding something. His restlessness. The way he kept glancing at the door whenever a stranger entered. The strange way he checked the bills. Elijah jotted down every detail on his phone. Around 1 o'clock, a group of employees finished their shift. Elijah stood up and walked towards the counter, pretending to ask about the menu, but in reality he wanted to get closer to the POS area. There, he saw Caleb adjusting the billing software with a tense expression. Elijah only glanced at it, but it was enough to see that a transaction had been timed. Timed? Why? Before he could think, Caleb returned. "What are you doing standing here?" Caleb asked, his voice full of suspicion. Elijah smiled politely. "Just checking out the new menu. I like the coffee here." Caleb narrowed his eyes, but said nothing more. Elijah returned to the table, his heart beating slightly faster, not out of fear, but because he had just discovered a clue. Caleb isn't just a rude person. He's hiding a much bigger wrongdoing. That afternoon, Elijah took Lily to Cresthill Ridge Park. They sat on a bench by the lake, watching the ripples spread across the water in the gentle breeze. Lily rested her head on his arm, and Elijah remained silent, letting his mind drift with the surface of the water. Daddy, are you thinking about Grace's job again?" Lily asked. Elijah chuckled because his little daughter was such a keen observer. "Yes, there are a few things Daddy needs to clarify." "Is Daddy scared?" Elijah looked at his daughter for a few seconds. A small question, but one that held a whole world of emotion. "Yes," Elijah said truthfully, "but Daddy thinks sometimes fear isn't a reason to stand still." Lily smiled and took his hand. "Then Daddy, go ahead and do it. I trust you, Daddy." Those 4 small words, "I trust Daddy," fell into Elijah's heart like a ray of light. In that moment he knew he couldn't turn back any longer. He will confront Caleb Monroe. He will uncover the truth. And he will stand by Grace Turner, wherever that leads him. The battle has begun. And Elijah Warren, a man once brought down by injustice, is stepping back with a stronger heart than ever. But he didn't know that. Caleb was starting to take notice of him too, and the darkness behind Caleb Monroe was far deeper than Elijah imagined. That morning, Maple and Shore Café opened as usual, but for Elijah Warren, the atmosphere was different. He was no longer just a customer. He walked in with a clear objective to observe Caleb Monroe, gather information, and uncover the truth behind Grace's suspension. Nevertheless, Elijah acted normally, like any middle-aged man visiting his usual coffee shop. He chose a table near the window, a spot from which he could observe the entire counter, the POS machine, and most importantly, Caleb. The coffee grinder hummed the aroma of espresso, filled the air, but Elijah wasn't focused on the scent. His eyes constantly shifted, observing every detail. What he didn't know was, Caleb was watching him today too. Caleb Monroe emerged from his small office in the cafe, clipboard in hand, his face contorted as if he were about to punish someone. His gleaming leather shoes clattered against the tiled floor with a rapid, forceful rhythm. But when he saw Elijah, Caleb's steps slowed. It was the same tall, dark-skinned man as yesterday, the same calm gaze, and he was sitting at the same table he'd been sitting at the day Grace was suspended. Caleb is an ophthalmologist. Why did he come back? Caleb disliked observers. He disliked people who were excessively quiet, and he disliked even more those who appeared smarter than him. He approached the counter, pretending to check the order, but his eyes were secretly glancing at Elijah through the coffee machine's mirror. Elijah was flipping through a small notebook, occasionally jotting down a few things. This made Caleb impatient. Lisa, Caleb called out loudly. The young barista flinched her hands, trembling slightly as she poured the milk into the pitcher. Yes, Mr. Monroe, do you know the man at table number 4? Lisa glanced at Elijah and shook her head. No, he seems like a stranger. Caleb stared at her intently as if checking to see if she was lying. Lisa trembled even more, trying to keep her lips tightly closed. Caleb said sternly, "If he asks anything about the system, the cameras, or Grace Turner, you report it to me immediately." Understood, Lisa nodded fearfully. Hearing that, Elijah felt a chill run down his spine. Caleb was on guard. There was no doubt about it. He's hiding something. Elijah showed no outward reaction. He took a sip of his Americano, his eyes fixed on the street to avoid attracting attention. But his heart pounded not out of fear, but because he knew. The game had officially begun. Late in the morning, Elijah left the bar, but he didn't go home right away. He drove to the parking lot behind the shopping center where Harold was waiting. Harold sat on a blue-painted bench, a cup of hot tea in his hand. When he saw Elijah arrive, he nodded calmly, but with eyes full of anticipation. "Elijah, what's new?" Elijah recounted how Caleb had been watching him and how Caleb had instructed his staff to keep an eye on him. Harold listened, frowning. So Caleb has started to get scared. Elijah sighed. "What's the point of being scared enough? I don't want Grace to be dragged into this any further." Harold leaned on his cane, his gaze fixed on the distance. "Elijah, you have to understand. When a powerful man starts to fear, the first thing he does is attack what he thinks threatens him. If Caleb suspects you, he won't sit idly by." Elijah looked down at his shoes. "That means I can't hide anymore," Harold said sternly. "You were never hidden, Elijah. People like you with character, intelligence, and charisma always stand out, and people like Caleb always recognize that." Elijah was silent for a long time. Harold's words touched a deep place in his heart, a place he had tried to convince himself he was just an ordinary man, a single father trying to raise his child. But when Harold emphasized leadership qualities, Elijah couldn't deny it. There was always a fire burning inside him. A fire that had once blazed fiercely at Horizon Tech, only to be extinguished so abruptly. Perhaps that flame will never die out. It will just wait for the right moment to flare up again. In the afternoon, Elijah picked Lily up from school. She ran out her feet, skipping her face rosy. "Daddy, today I was chosen to draw a poster with the theme, 'Be kind at school.'" Elijah laughed. "You're so clever, Lily. My teacher told me to draw a good person saving a stranger." "Just like Daddy." Elijah paused slightly. "Like Daddy." "Yes, I told my teacher about Daddy helping Harold in the rain." She said, "Kindness is powerful." Elijah stood still. That saying, "kindness is powerful," fell like a ray of sunshine into the darkest corners of his heart. Because in truth, what he's doing also stems from kindness. Not ambition, not hatred, just kindness. And perhaps that is the greatest strength in his life. He picked Lily up and spun her around, making her giggle. That evening, after Lily had fallen asleep, Elijah prepared his documents, reviewing the notes he had taken over the past few days. Caleb's behavior, the staff's expressions, the unusual behavior at the POS counter. But while he was concentrating, the phone rang. Unknown number. Not saved in contacts. No name. Elijah hesitated for a second before answering the phone. "Hello." The voice on the other end was deep and arrogant. "Mr. Warren. I've been watching you for several days now. I hope you know what you're doing." Elijah jumped to his feet. "Caleb." A very soft laugh. "You're just a customer having coffee, but you're looking like you're investigating something. I want to remind you, not to be too curious." Elijah clutched the phone tightly. "I don't like the way you treat your employees," Elijah said, his voice low but firm. Caleb laughed loudly again. "Oh, and who do you think you are to judge me, Elijah? I know you're a failure at Horizon Tech. Don't try to play the hero anymore." Elijah's heart sank. Caleb knew who he was. He had looked him up. "Elijah," Caleb continued, his voice cold. "If I were you, I'd go back to being a normal, gentle father. Because if you keep meddling in things that aren't your business, I'm not sure you can protect yourself, let alone your daughter." That statement was like a knife cutting through the air. For a moment, Elijah felt the entire room go dark. "Did you just threaten my son?" Elijah asked, his voice so low that even he was surprised. Caleb was silent for a few seconds. Then he said, "Just advice. Good night. Hang up." Elijah stood motionless. His throat tightened. It wasn't out of fear. It was because anger was rising as powerful as a storm. No one is allowed to mention Lily. No one is allowed to touch the most precious thing in his life. He walked to the window, watching the streetlights reflect on the wet pavement. A light rain had begun to fall on Cresthill. Elijah closed his eyes. Harold once said, "When the man in power is afraid, the first thing he does is attack." Caleb attacked, and Elijah knew. When someone lays a child with a single father, it's no longer an investigation. It's a fight. He returned to his desk and opened his notebook. On the blank page, he wrote a line in a bold, strong stroke. "I'm going to put an end to this." Outside, the rain falls steadily, reminding him, it all began on a rainy night, and perhaps it will all end under another rainstorm. The next morning, a thin layer of mist hung over Cresthill like a breath clinging to the ground. When Elijah awoke, the dim light filtering through the curtains softened the room, but the lingering effects of the previous night's call still weighed on his mind. Caleb's threat still echoed in his mind. "I'm not sure you can protect yourself, let alone your daughter." Elijah washed his face with cold water. The water felt like a slap in the face of lingering fear, but it also cleared his head. He wasn't the type to back down when threatened, especially when someone was messing with Lily. He walked into his daughter's room. Lily was still asleep, her breathing soft, her curly hair spread across the pillow. Elijah stood there for a few seconds just to remember what he was fighting for. Because of this little girl, because of kindness, because of himself. He gently pulled the blanket up for his daughter and went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. The bacon sizzled as it fried. The aroma of butter filled the air. When Lily woke up, she appeared with her familiar smile. "Daddy, I want hot cocoa today." Elijah smiled. "Understood, princess." While making a drink, Elijah watched his daughter, her pink pajamas, her little feet tapping gently to the rhythm of the song she was humming. The sight made him clench his fists, a reminder that he couldn't afford to be weak. Today he will confront Caleb. No more observing from afar. Today he will begin gathering evidence. After dropping Lily off at school, Elijah drove to Maple and Shore Café. He parked in the back where the area's cameras weren't very clear. Not because he wanted to do anything wrong, but because he didn't want Caleb to realize he was watching. The rain last night had wet the sidewalk, reflecting the cafe's image like a hazy mirror. He stood a little distance away for a moment, looking through the glass. The staff were busy. Caleb was nowhere to be seen. Elijah opened his phone and reviewed the notes. Times Caleb adjusted the transaction time. Asterisk, Caleb threatened the staff. Asterisk, Caleb engaged in questionable conduct with the POS system. Asterisk, Grace was suspended on the very day she reported an unusually low performance. There are too many questionable points. Elijah walked into the cafe. The doorbell rang with a familiar sound. Lisa, the young barista, saw him and was momentarily startled, but then she bowed slightly as if to say, "Thank you for coming back." Elijah nodded in response. Caleb wasn't at the counter, but Elijah knew he was somewhere. The tension in the air foreshadowed it. Elijah ordered an Americano. When Lisa brought it out, she lowered her voice slightly. "Something's going on with the system, brother. I've seen Caleb go into the control room and lock the door." Elijah tilted his head. "Did you see him do anything specific?" Lisa pursed her lips. "Yesterday. I saw him holding a stack of paper bills, but I didn't know what they were for. He was very careful and very afraid of anyone seeing them." Elijah made a note on his phone. Lisa swallowed hard and then added, "Be careful. He said there might be a surprise internal inspection today. I don't know what he's planning." Elijah thanked her and returned to his desk. He began constructing a logical map in his head. Times Caleb adjusted the POS system. Asterisk, he adjusted the trading hours. Asterisk, he keeps the paper receipts. Asterisk, he was afraid of being inspected. Asterisk, and he threatened him. An innocent person would not behave like that. Around 11 o'clock, Caleb appeared. He was wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a forced smile on his face, but his eyes were as sharp as knives. Elijah bent down as if checking his phone, but he was observing through the reflective surface of the table. Caleb wasn't looking at the customer. He was staring straight at Elijah's desk. He knew he was being watched. Caleb approached the counter and whispered something to his assistant. The assistant then ran into the back room and closed the door. The door wasn't locked, but everyone knew Caleb didn't like strangers entering. Elijah stood up pretending to go outside to make a phone call. But instead of going straight ahead, he walked around to the back of the bar where there was a side door leading to the storage room and office. There he heard Caleb's voice tense, hurried, and agitated. "No, I told you already. The transfer can't be made right now. The reporting system is under review." Elijah stood, pressed against the wall, his heart pounding. What if they find out about the discrepancies in revenue? "No, I won't lose this position. There's an outsider watching. A black guy. I'll deal with him." Elijah gritted his teeth. It wasn't because Caleb called him in a derogatory tone, something he'd heard his whole life. It was because Caleb was involved in financial fraud. Caleb's voice continued. "No, I'm not afraid of Bishop. He's old and not capable of running things anymore." Elijah's eyes widened. "Caleb is talking about Harold. But Bishop's daughter is a different story. She knows too much. I have to get her out of the bar before she opens her mouth." Elijah stood still. Grace was suspended, not for any fault, but because she knew something, and Caleb was afraid of that. In that moment, Elijah knew he was on the right track. He stepped back a few paces to avoid being seen, but just as he turned away, the door to the side room burst open. Caleb walked out. The two faced each other. No avoidance, no pretense. A moment of extreme tension. Caleb squinted slightly. "You've shown up at just the right time again, Warren." Elijah kept his voice calm. "I just went outside to make a phone call." Caleb stepped closer now, only a few feet from Elijah. The pungent smell of his cologne wafted into Elijah's face. "Elijah, let me be honest. I don't know who you think you are, but this isn't a place for you to meddle in," Elijah replied, slowly enunciating each word. "Clearly, I intervene when people are treated unfairly." Caleb laughed a laugh as sharp as metal. "Do you think you're a hero? Remember, they kicked you out of the very company you founded, and they did that because you weren't a good fit." Elijah didn't react. He didn't let his pride be hurt. He didn't let himself be swayed. Caleb leaned in and whispered, "You don't belong here anymore, and I'm going to make you disappear from this place." That's when Elijah looked straight into Caleb's eyes, without trembling, without blinking. The more he threatens, the more it proves he's guilty. Caleb clenched his jaw. For a moment, Elijah thought he was about to throw a punch. But Caleb just said, "Let's wait and see who gets eliminated from this game." And he turned away, leaving Elijah standing alone. But Elijah didn't tremble. On the contrary, his eyes sharpened. Harder, more resolute. He had heard enough to know Caleb is cheating on sales. Grace finds out. Caleb suspends her to silence her. And now Caleb wants to get rid of Elijah, too. Elijah hurried to the car. He had to tell Harold. He had to prepare for the next step. That evening, Elijah sat in his small office. On his desk were his laptop, a notebook, and some invoices he had gotten from Lisa after her shift ended. Lily was asleep. The house was quiet. Elijah switched on the desk lamp. The warm light illuminated his face, highlighting his strong features, deep eyes, a tightly closed mouth. He started analyzing the invoice. And then, he noticed something unusual. The paper invoice does not match the time in the system. The amount is rounded down. The POS machine saves the editing history. Elijah sat up straight. This is the proof. Caleb not only cheated, he also tried to cover it up by tampering with the system. Elijah's phone rang. Message from Harold. "Elijah, I just received an internal audit alert. Caleb is creating a fake report. They'll be coming next week. You need to be careful." Elijah looked at the screen. His eyes became sharper than ever. "Harold," Elijah replied, "we're about to expose him." But when he put the phone down, he didn't know that Caleb was also preparing an even more dangerous move. One move could turn everything around and draw Elijah into a no-win situation. On Friday morning, the sky over Cresthill was so gloomy it seemed the city itself sensed what was about to happen. Gray clouds covered the eastern block of buildings, and a biting wind blew. Elijah left home earlier than usual after dropping Lily off at school. He knew today wasn't like any other. Today, Caleb was going to make his move. As Elijah drove to Maple and Shore Café, he sensed something was amiss. The parking lot was busier than usual. A luxurious black SUV was parked prominently near the cafe entrance. It wasn't a regular customer's car. Elijah took a deep breath. He walked into the bar. The doorbell rang and the entire restaurant fell silent. The staff bowed their heads, avoiding Caleb's gaze. That was enough for Elijah to know what awaited him. In the brightly lit space, Caleb Monroe stood there, a crisp white shirt, a navy tie, his face expressionless as if he had already won. Next to Caleb was a strange woman, blonde hair neatly tied back, a gray suit, and a thick stack of files in her hand. Caleb looked at Elijah with a triumphant expression. "Good morning, Elijah," he said in a suspiciously smooth voice. "I've been waiting for you." Elijah stood upright, not flinching. "What's wrong, Caleb?" The woman spoke first, her voice even and cold. "I'm Patricia Clark, Regional Compliance Department, Maple and Shore." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. Caleb gave a half smile. "We have received reports of irregularities in operations at this store, and some questionable conduct on your part." Elijah narrowed his eyes. "Lack of transparency." My own Patricia opened the file and read aloud. "This includes unauthorized access to internal storage systems, access to invoices and documents outside the scope of assigned duties. There are also suspicions of collecting employees' personal data without notification." The accusations fell like boulders. Elijah took a deep breath, keeping his voice calm. "I only checked what was problematic. I reported it to Bishop." "I didn't," Caleb cut across immediately. "You're lying. You didn't tell anyone." A commotion spread through the restaurant. Lisa looked up, her eyes filled with anxiety. Tommy emerged from the kitchen, his face tense. Patricia continued. "Given these allegations, we are forced to temporarily suspend him pending investigation." Suspend. Those two words struck Elijah like a blow to the chest. He tried to remain calm. "Let me ask," Elijah said clearly, "who sent this report?" Patricia glanced at Caleb, then replied blandly, "The report was submitted anonymously." Elijah chuckled softly, not loudly but full of understanding. "Anonymous? Or is it you?" Caleb shrugged. "I was just doing what was necessary to protect the store, and Patricia here completely agrees with that." Patricia maintained a neutral stance, as if she didn't care about right or wrong, only about the process. Caleb took a step closer to Elijah, whispering in a voice just loud enough for the two of them to hear, "I told you so. Wherever you stick, I'll cut there." Elijah didn't answer. It wasn't necessary. His gaze was cold and sharp as steel, but inside his heart skipped a beat. He thought of Lily. He thought of the little house, the bills, the hopeful breakfasts they shared together. This could turn everything upside down. Caleb stood up straight, turned to face the middle of the bar, and said loudly, "Ladies and gentlemen, Elijah Warren will be taking a leave of absence. All internal operations will be handled by—" A voice interrupted. "Enough." The whole restaurant turned around. Grace is standing at the door. She had been missing from the shop for days since her suspension. Today she appeared with resolute eyes and lingering fear, but there was something else, confidence. She walked straight towards Elijah. "I have something to say," Grace said, her voice strong but slightly trembling. Elijah did nothing wrong. Caleb clenched his jaw. "Grace, you should go home. You don't need to work anymore." "I knew he was cheating," Grace said bluntly. "I saw him altering invoices. I saw him changing transaction times. And when I confronted him, he suspended me." The atmosphere was explosive. Lisa covered her mouth with her hand. Tommy stood frozen. Patricia's eyes widened, and she immediately flipped through the files. Caleb burst into loud laughter, an unpleasant, defiant laugh. "Do you have any evidence?" Grace remained silent. And that's when Caleb realized she didn't have any evidence with her. He launched his attack. "So you're just making things up to cover up your wrongdoing. Patricia, see, this is exactly the kind of incompetent employee I'm dealing with." Grace ran up with anger. Elijah stepped forward and stood beside her. "She's telling the truth." Patricia asked, "Do you have any proof, Elijah?" Elijah looked straight at her. "I'm collecting them, and I'll send them to Mr. Bishop." Caleb smirked. "Unfortunately, you no longer have access to the files." Elijah clenched his fist. He knew he had fallen into a trap. Caleb had gotten ahead of him using an internal system to block all his escape routes. Patricia took the pen and signed the document, "Elijah Warren suspension, effective immediately. Please leave the store." As Elijah stepped out of Maple and Shore, the cold wind intensified. The sky was overcast, as if it were about to rain. Elijah stood under the eaves, taking deep breaths to calm himself. Grace followed him. her voice choked with emotion. Elijah, I'm sorry. I should have recorded a video that day. I was so scared. Elijah placed his hand gently on her shoulder. Grace, it's not your fault. Caleb has been doing this for a long time. He knows how to cover his tracks. We just need patience. Grace looked at him, surprised that he remained so calm despite the risk of losing his job and income. Elijah smiled wearily. Sometimes, victory comes from standing firm longer than your attacker. But as he turned away, that smile vanished. He knew this was a major turning point. Being suspended meant Caleb could alter the record, destroy evidence, and twist the story to his detriment. He walked to the car, his hands trembling slightly, not because he was afraid for himself, but because he was thinking of Lily. On the way home, Elijah's phone rang. He saw the caller's name, Harold Bishop. His heart was pounding. He pressed play. Elijah, Harold's voice was heavy. I received notification of your suspension. This wasn't from central office. Caleb bypassed me. Elijah closed his eyes. I guess so. Do you have any evidence? Yes, Elijah said. But that's not enough, Harold sighed. You have to be careful. Caleb has connections with some people in the regional finance department. If he wants to get rid of you, he won't hesitate to use any means necessary. Elijah gripped the steering wheel tightly. I'm not stopping, Harold. I know, Harold replied. But remember, before you can prove him wrong, you have to survive. That statement left Elijah speechless. Survival, this level, has crossed the line from an internal dispute. It has become a power struggle in which Elijah is the challenger, and Caleb wouldn't let it slide so easily. When Elijah arrived home, Lily ran to hug him. That little smile was like a lifeline in the storm. Daddy, the teacher, praised my drawing today. Elijah bent down and hugged his child. Dad is proud of you, but his heart was heavy. Your daughter deserves a peaceful life, and you must fight to keep that. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Elijah opened his laptop. He took out the notes and invoices Lisa had given him. He opened each video file he had recorded earlier. He put everything into a folder named Caleb Evidence, Part 1. He didn't know where this would lead him. He only knew one thing. The real battle has only just begun. And if Caleb thinks Elijah is easily intimidated, then he chose the wrong opponent. On Monday morning, Cresthill was still damp after the night's rain. Streaks of water clung to the windows and weak sunlight filtered through the heavy clouds. Elijah sat in his old Toyota, his hands on the steering wheel, his heart heavy. He's not going to work today, because he is no longer allowed to go to work. Instead, he sat in the parking lot behind Maple and Shore Café, observing. Not because he wanted to do anything wrong, but because he knew, if he didn't watch Caleb today, he would miss the most important opportunity to prove the truth. In the rearview mirror, Elijah saw little Lily sitting in the back seat, hugging her drawing book to her lap. Daddy, are you upset about your job? Elijah turned around, trying to force a gentle smile. Dad's fine, just a little tired. But Lily looked straight into his eyes, her round brown eyes seemingly seeing through the storm raging in her father's heart. Mom used to say, when Dad is sad, he's quieter than usual. Elijah took a deep breath. Lily always pays attention to everything. He placed his hand on the little girl's head, gently stroking her soft, curly hair. Lily. Sometimes adults get into trouble. But you know what? The important thing is not to give up. The little girl nodded, then hugged her sketchbook to her chest, as if keeping a promise. Elijah dropped Lily off at their neighbor Marcy's house and returned to the parking lot. He opened his laptop. A notepad appeared with small print POS log. Transaction correction Thursday invoice discrepancy. Grace. Suspended immediately after questioning about document correction. He stared intently at the screen. Caleb didn't just cheat. He manipulated the system to cover up all traces. The phone vibrates. Caller's name, Lisa. Elijah pressed play. Lisa's voice trembled. Could you come to the back of the shop for a moment? I have something to tell you. What's going on? I can't say it over the phone, but I know what Caleb is planning to do next. Elijah held his breath for a second. I'll be there right away. Behind the cafe, where the sunlight was blocked by the old brick wall, Lisa stood huddled in her thin coat, her eyes red and swollen. Elijah approached her. Lisa, are you okay? She shook her head, clenching her fists so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Elijah, Caleb had a private meeting with us this morning. He said someone was trying to sabotage the store and asked all staff to remain silent in front of the compliance department. Elijah clenched his jaw. Did he mention you? Lisa bowed her head. He said you were unemployed, had caused trouble at your previous company, and might be trying to sue the store for personal gain. Elijah stood still. Every word Lisa spoke was like a knife cutting into his deepest self-esteem. Not only because they were lies, but because Caleb had dug into Elijah's weakest spot, his past at Horizon Tech, which he didn't want to talk about. But that's not all, Lisa continued. Elijah looked up. He said, if anyone dared to speak to you or to Mr. Bishop, he would fire them immediately. No question about it. A cold wind blew across the parking lot, sweeping up the yellow leaves at Lisa's feet. She shivered, but not from the cold. Elijah, I'm so scared. He placed his hand on her shoulder, his voice very soft. Lisa, you did the right thing. You dared to tell the truth. Lisa bit her lip, her eyes lowered. I just don't want your kindness to be trampled on like that. Elijah wanted to answer, but his throat was constricted. In the end, he only said, thank you. Harold called at lunchtime. Elijah, I'm on my way to Cresthill. We need to meet in person. Elijah, I have bad news, Harold said as soon as he answered the phone. Caleb has sent a formal report to headquarters. He accuses you of sabotage and threatening employees. Elijah squinted. I didn't do any of that. I know, Harold replied. But Caleb knows how to twist the truth, and he has connections in the regional finance department. Elijah walked quickly out to the open space behind the bar, away from passers-by. Harold, what can we do to counterattack? After a long pause, Harold finally spoke. You need evidence, and not just any evidence. It has to be irrefutable. We need someone who has seen Caleb do wrong and has the courage to testify. Elijah looked down at his dusty shoes. Lisa, Grace, Tommy, they all knew. But they were afraid of losing their jobs. Afraid of Caleb's revenge. Harold continued. Elijah, I'm sorry for putting pressure on you, but you're the only one they can trust. When you stand by them, they'll be stronger. Elijah sighed. Let me try. That afternoon, Elijah went to Maple and Shore again. He didn't go inside. He stood across the street, observing. Inside the restaurant, Caleb was laughing and talking with Patricia, a member of the compliance department. Both looked like they were celebrating. Elijah gritted his teeth. Okay, if you like strategy games, I know how to play them too. He took out his phone and dialed a number. Grace, are you free tonight? I need to talk. She hesitated. Yes, but I'm so scared, Elijah. I don't want to lose my job again. Elijah, his voice deepened, becoming serious and forceful. You lost your job for daring to do the right thing, and I won't let that happen again. There was a few seconds of silence on the other end of the line, then Grace whispered, I trust you. That evening at a small Mexican restaurant, Elijah sat with Grace and Lisa. The dim yellow lighting and the lively sounds of the street outside made their conversation feel safer. Grace spoke first. Elijah, I lied while I was suspended. I was afraid to confront Caleb. But it's true, I saw him altering documents. And that day he used his power to force me to keep quiet. Lisa nodded in agreement. I also know that Caleb isn't transparent. I saw him ask his staff to delete logs many times, but everyone was afraid to speak up. Elijah looked at the two women sitting in front of him. They weren't just employees. They were people more honest than Caleb could ever understand in his lifetime. I need you two as witnesses, Elijah said softly but clearly. Not so I can win, but so the truth can be told, and so that people like Caleb won't continue to harm others. The space was silent for a moment. Then Grace clenched her fists and nodded. I'll do it. Lisa took a deep breath and placed her hands on the table. I'll do it too. Elijah breathed a sigh of relief, a breath he had held in his chest for days. He is no longer alone. As he neared home, Elijah's phone rang. A text message from an unknown number. Mr. Warren, it's best to stop. Don't lose more than the job. Elijah stared intently at the screen. His hand trembled slightly, not out of fear, but out of anger. No one is allowed to threaten him. No one is allowed to threaten Lily. No one is allowed to abuse their power to oppress others. Elijah deleted the message, then sent back a single line. I'm not stopping. Then he turned off the machine. The sky over Cresthill darkened. The night wind blew through the trees as if foreshadowing something big to come. A confrontation. A truth is about to be revealed. And Elijah Warren, who was once knocked down at Horizon Tech, now stands firm against a much larger shadow. The war isn't over. But tonight he knows one thing for sure. This time he wasn't fighting alone. That night, Cresthill was shrouded in a soft darkness. Streetlights cast a golden glow onto the dew-covered pavement, reflecting off the scattered leaves. Inside Elijah's small house, the light from his desk illuminated his face, cold, focused, yet thoughtful. Laptop open. Notepad ready. Heart ready, too. And Elijah knew tonight would decide the course of events. The battle between him and Caleb was no longer just his battle. Lily was asleep in her room. Her steady breathing brought a little peace to the house filled with anxiety. Elijah looked at the door of her room, then returned to his desk, his gaze becoming more resolute. He opened a new audio file. He put the phone down. He took a deep breath. Tonight I need to prepare for my meeting with Harold tomorrow morning. He skimmed through the evidence photocopies of invoices, Lisa's notes, Grace's testimony. But Elijah knew that wasn't enough. Caleb was too cunning. Mere suspicious evidence wouldn't bring him down. He needed something solid, something that couldn't be bent, something that couldn't be denied. Suddenly the phone rang. The caller ID showed Tommy Rivers. Elijah picked up the phone immediately. "Tommy, what's wrong?" On the other end of the line, Tommy's voice was so low you'd have to lean close to hear it. "Elijah, I need to see you, but not at home, not near the bar. He's watching us." Elijah jumped up from his chair. "Him? You mean Caleb?" Tommy's voice trembled. "I'm not sure. But lately there's been a black SUV parked near my apartment. Last night I saw it follow me home from the supermarket. I think he suspects I know something." Elijah clutched the phone tightly. "Tommy, are you okay? I'm fine, but I can't sleep." "Elijah, I'll help you. Only you dare to stand up to him. I have something. It might be the evidence you need." Elijah's heart was pounding. "Where are you?" "The parking lot behind Cresthill Ridge Park. It's 10 minutes from my house. I'll be right there." When Elijah arrived at the parking lot, the night wind was blowing strongly, carrying the damp scent of the forest. Long shadows of trees stretched across the ground. The space was so quiet that he could hear his own footsteps. In the corner of the parking lot, Tommy stood there wearing a baseball cap, his hands tucked deep into his jacket pockets, his eyes darting around as if afraid of being watched. Elijah stepped forward. "Tommy." Before he could say anything more, Tommy gestured for him to be quiet. "He has eyes and ears everywhere, Elijah. I don't want to be overheard." Elijah nodded. Tommy reached into his jacket, pulled out a small silver USB drive, and handed it to Elijah. "It contains a backup of the internal security camera footage from last week. I got it before Caleb made Lisa change the system password. I don't know what's in it, but I saw him going in and out of the office late at night. For several nights in a row." Elijah looked at the USB drive in his hand. Small, but it could be the spark that burns down the facade Caleb has built. "Tommy, why are you helping me?" Elijah asked. Tommy took a deep breath, his voice lowering. "Because you were the first one to stand up for Grace. We were always scared. But you weren't afraid. Elijah, if it weren't for you, Grace would have lost her job forever. And Caleb would have continued to boss us around." Elijah placed his hand on Tommy's shoulder and squeezed gently. "You did the right thing. I won't let you get involved." Tommy shook his head. "Elijah, I'm not doing this for protection. I'm doing it so I can sleep peacefully at night." His eyes gleamed in the darkness. Elijah understood that feeling, the feeling of living in fear for too long and feeling suffocated. Tommy turned and took a few steps, then stopped. "Elijah, watch out for Caleb. He's not like the others. He'll do anything to protect his seat." "Thank you," Elijah said softly. Tommy nodded, then left into the night. Elijah paused for a moment, looking at the USB in his hand, feeling a slight chill from the metal spreading across his skin. This war will be even more brutal than you imagine. When Elijah arrived home, the clock showed 1152. He made a cup of black coffee and inserted the USB drive into his laptop. The screen lit up. Folders appeared. And just as Tommy had said, there were dozens of videos that Caleb hadn't managed to delete in time. He opened each file. The scene begins with the café closing. Lisa leaves. Tommy leaves. 10:41 p.m. The office lights came on. Caleb Monroe's name appeared in the frame. Elijah fast-forwarded. Caleb opened the small safe in his office. He took out a stack of bills. He sat down at his desk. He opened his laptop. Then Elijah saw the most important thing. Caleb clicked on the Edit Transaction Log option, which is only for regional administrators or owners. But Harold never granted him this authority. Elijah tilted his head, his eyes wide open. Caleb entered the password. The system opened. He altered the transaction times. He deleted the log of a large invoice. He inserted a new invoice matching the missing amount that week. Elijah didn't take his eyes off the screen. This is no longer a rule violation. This is a criminal offense. But that's not all. When Caleb stood up, he turned his back, and for a brief moment Elijah saw something no one had ever mentioned. He secretly slipped a thick envelope into his jacket pocket. Elijah rewinds, stops at the right frame, zooms in, cash, some printed receipts. Elijah took a deep breath. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Caleb embezzled funds, and he did it every week. Elijah slumped into his chair, not out of despair, but because he finally had a weapon. The evidence is irrefutable. It cannot be distorted. It cannot be erased. But the relief was short-lived as his phone rang. A text message, an unknown number. You think hiding behind a screen is safe? Don't forget I'm always one step ahead of you. Elijah stared at the message. Then he replied with a short but sharp reply. Tomorrow morning you'll see you're wrong. He put the phone down, turned off the desk lamp, closed his eyes. He couldn't sleep tonight. Not out of fear, but because he knew that tomorrow was the day he would begin his counterattack. On the desk, moonlight fell on the small USB drive. Small, quiet. But within it lay the power to change Elijah's life and overthrow Caleb Monroe's empire of lies. The following morning, Cresthill brightened after a night of heavy rain. Every road was covered in water, the passing vehicles leaving long, shimmering trails. The sky remained gray, but within that gray there was an unusual stillness, as if the entire city were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Elijah stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his light blue shirt. He wasn't going to work, but today he was preparing to fight, not with his fists, not with threats, but with the truth. When Lily came out of the bedroom, hugging her stuffed rabbit, she looked at him and asked, "Daddy, did you go talk to Uncle Harold again today?" Elijah bent down, tied his daughter's shoelaces, then looked her straight in the eyes. "Yes, today I have an important task to do, to protect those who are treated unfairly, to protect both myself and you." Lily placed her hand gently on his cheek. "Dad, remember to smile. Mom says that when you smile, bad things will seem less bad." Elijah smiled genuinely, not to reassure her, but because her words warmed his heart in a way only a child could. He dropped Lily off at Marcy's house and then drove to the meeting place, the small café on the corner where Harold was waiting. Harold Bishop sat at the patio table, cappuccino in hand, his face more serious than usual. When Elijah approached, he immediately stood up. "Elijah, do you have it yet?" Elijah handed over a small silver USB drive. "It's all in here. I checked it last night." He directly edited the logs, deleted transactions, and added fake invoices. There's even footage of him putting the envelopes in his jacket pocket. Harold clutched the USB drive tightly in his hand as if it were a bomb. "We have to act now," he said. "But not yet. Do you understand?" Elijah nodded. "Caleb is the kind of person who, when cornered, will attack recklessly. Every move has to be precise." Harold leaned closer and whispered, "This morning I'm going to Maple and Shore. I want you to come with me. But this time, you won't stand next to me. You'll stand behind me. I want to see how Caleb reacts before we know we have the evidence." Elijah understood immediately. A test of reaction. A way for Caleb to corner himself. He only asked one question. "Are you ready?" Harold replied in a low, firm voice. "I've been ready since the day you saved me in the rain." 9 a.m. Maple and Shore Café was as crowded as ever. The aroma of pastries mingled with the sound of espresso being brewed, creating a familiar, bustling atmosphere. But today, that hustle and bustle was masked by an invisible layer of tension. Lisa stood behind the counter, her face turning pale as she saw Elijah walk in. Tommy stopped stirring the pan, glancing at him anxiously for a few seconds. Elijah walked slowly, unhurriedly, without lowering his head. He walked like someone who knew he was there to change something. Caleb Monroe was standing in the middle of the bar, checking the work schedule. When he saw Elijah, his face contorted slightly, then quickly changed into a sarcastic smile. "Elijah Warren, I thought you were suspended." Before Elijah could reply, the rear window opened. The sound of high-end shoes echoed on the tiled floor. Harold Bishop walked in, The restaurant immediately fell silent. Tommy put down his spoon. Lisa let out a sigh. A few guests whispered. Caleb turned pale for a split second, then tried to regain his composure. Harold looked around, a slight but cold smile on his face. I heard that this store was having problems, so I decided to drop by without prior notice. Caleb swallowed. Ah, Mr. Bishop, I've prepared a full report. I'm trying to keep things under control. Under control, Harold repeated, his voice drawn out. Yes, sir. And Elijah is no longer on the bar's staff. I handled it according to regulations. I provided sufficient explanation. Harold turned to Elijah. There was absolute trust in his gaze. That's right, you've presented sufficient reasons, Harold said. Caleb breathed a sigh of relief. Too soon. Because Harold ends the sentence with, but I want to hear that reason again right in front of my employees and customers. The whole restaurant fell silent again. Caleb swallowed hard. Elijah interfered with the system, affected revenue, and intimidated employees. I was forced to suspend him. Harold nodded. So, do you have proof? Caleb paused. B. Evidence. Yes, Harold said clearly, emphasizing each word. The evidence you have is that Elijah did something wrong. Caleb rolled his eyes, sweat beading on his forehead. I'm not right here. But Harold interrupted, his voice sharp as a knife. But I do. Elijah stood up straighter. Lisa put her hand to her mouth. Tommy's eyes widened. Caleb ran slightly. Sir, what do you need? Harold took the USB drive out of his pocket and held it up in front of everyone in the bar. Proof that you tampered with the system. Proof that you deleted transactions. Proof that you received money into your own pocket. His words fell like thunderbolts, each one striking with force. Caleb was speechless. No, he can't. Harold took a step forward. It's all on the internal security cameras. And also the testimony of the employees here. Caleb looked around. Lisa lowered her head but stood close to Elijah as if to affirm that she was no longer afraid. Tommy stood behind the kitchen counter, still holding a spoon, but his gaze was resolute. Grace entered the restaurant at that moment, her eyes fixed on Caleb without flinching. The whole place now looks like a courtroom, Caleb whispered. You all have betrayed me. Elijah looked him straight in the eye, calmly but forcefully. Nobody is against you, Caleb. They're just standing for the truth. Caleb blushed, his voice cracking. I do it for the store. I maintain the process. I maintain the revenue, Harold gestured to Elijah. Elijah stepped forward. His voice was low and slow, but each word seemed to strike directly into the air. He doesn't manage the revenue. He keeps the money for himself. He doesn't protect the employees. He threatens them. He doesn't maintain the store. He exploits it to enrich himself through fraud. Caleb ran up. Who are you to speak to me like that? You're just a failure at Horizon Tech, a slain out of the company, a pathetic single father. That remark caused a wave of outrage throughout the bar. Lisa shook her head. Tommy snorted. Several customers shook their heads in shock. But Elijah remained unwavering. He looked at Caleb, his gaze deep and calm. Yes, I've failed. I've lost everything. But failure doesn't turn me into a cheat. It doesn't turn me into a threat to others. It doesn't turn me into someone who bows down to injustice. Everyone held their breath. Elijah lowered his voice, but the weight of his words didn't diminish. You called me the pathetic one, but it is precisely that pathos that helps me understand the fear of those you oppress. It is that very pathos that gives me the strength to stand up today. Harold nodded, then declared, From this moment on, Caleb Monroe is completely suspended. He will face an investigation from both regional and legal authorities. Caleb was breathing heavily. You've ruined me, Harold replied softly. No, you're destroying yourself. A thud echoed. Caleb dropped the clipboard to the ground. He looked around, desperate, like someone about to be dragged into a pit of his own making. Elijah turned away, but before leaving, he said softly, No one has to put others down to look taller, Caleb, but you never understood that. Caleb bowed his head. For the first time, he was completely silent. The confrontation is over, and Caleb's power structure officially crumbled. As they left the bar, Harold patted Elijah on the shoulder. Elijah, you've done even better than I expected. Elijah didn't smile. He looked up at the sky where a glimmer of sunlight had just begun to appear. Mr. Harold, this isn't the end. Caleb won't give up easily. Harold nodded. I know. But now, you're not fighting alone anymore. A gentle breeze was blowing. The smell of the storm was gone. Only the feeling of peace after the tempest remained. Elijah walked away, his body lighter but his heart weighed down by something even heavier. He knew the journey was long, but for the first time he saw real hope. That afternoon, Cresthill was bathed in rare rays of sunlight that pierced through the thick clouds, illuminating the still, damp pavement. Amidst the gentle spring chill, Elijah walked slowly along the sidewalk, each step feeling as if it were carrying him away from a storm that had lasted far too long. After the morning confrontation, Maple and Shore Café temporarily closed so Harold could inspect the entire system. Caleb was escorted out of the cafe in silence, devoid of any arrogance. But Elijah knew that silence wasn't the end. Sometimes, before the biggest storm, everything is unusually quiet. He stopped in front of the small park, the place where a few days earlier Tommy had tremblingly handed him the USB drive. He sat down on a wooden bench, looking up at the gradually clearing sky. There was a sense of relief, but it didn't completely calm his heart. Because there's one thing nobody knows, one thing only he carries with him. And today, Harold requested a meeting with him about that very thing. When Elijah arrived at Maple and Shore's temporary office, Harold was already waiting, his gaze serious yet strangely warm. "Elijah, please sit down." He sat down, his hands clasped together. "We won, didn't we?" Elijah asked. Harold shook his head slightly. "We've only won one battle. We haven't won the whole war yet." Elijah wasn't surprised. He knew more was to come: the legal investigation, the internal reports, Caleb's potential retaliation. It wasn't over yet. Harold gave Elijah a cup of hot tea. "I watched the whole video, and I want you to know if it weren't for you, things would never have come to light." Elijah just smiled faintly. "I was just doing the right thing." Harold leaned back in his chair, gazing at Elijah for a long time, as if contemplating something momentous. "Elijah, I want to propose something to you." He tilted his head slightly. "What is your request?" Harold placed the file on the table. "Have you ever thought about going back to being a manager?" Elijah was stunned. He said, "Me, yes. I want you to be the manager of Maple and Shore in Cresthill. Completely replace Caleb. And if you want, I can open a seat for you on the Regional Strategy Council." Elijah said nothing. His chest swelled with mixed emotions: pride, gratitude, but also fear. Harold looked him straight in the eye. "You have those qualities. You're steadfast, kind, strong, but not ostentatious. You see people not just numbers. That's what a true leader needs." Elijah smiled faintly, his eyes filled with sadness. I used to be a leader, Harold." Harold nodded. "I know, and I also know what's going on at Horizon Tech." Elijah paused. "He knows," Harold continued. "I know you were fired for speaking out against unfair layoffs. I know your shielding of a new group of employees displeased the top executives. They don't want a young CEO who dares to go against the established order." Elijah clenched his fists. "Nobody believed me. They said I was causing trouble. They said I didn't fit in with the company culture." Harold smiled sadly. "Cultural incompatibility sometimes means you're too kind for them to control you." Elijah laughed, a weary laugh, as if someone had finally spoken what he had kept in his heart for years. "But do you know what I admire most about you?" Harold asked. Elijah shook his head. "You failed, but you didn't become bitter. You didn't vent your anger on anyone else. You remained kind even though that very kindness had once hurt you." Elijah bent down, his vision blurring for a moment. Harold placed his hand on the table. "And that's why I want you to lead." Elijah took a deep breath, as if regaining his breath. I'm very grateful, but I need time. I don't want to repeat the mistake. I don't want Lily to go through another shock if her father fails again." Harold nodded without pressing the matter. "You have time. But Elijah, sometimes fear is a sign that you're on the right track." When Elijah stepped outside, the sky over Cresthill had cleared and the sunlight shone on his face, but his heart was in turmoil. He walked slowly along the sidewalk. The aroma of freshly baked goods from a nearby shop wafted through the air, mingling with the chirping of birds. The only question in his mind was, can I start my life over again? In front of him was the park where Lily used to run and play every afternoon. He sat down on a wooden bench, watching the young leaves sway gently in the breeze. "If I accept the new position, my life will change completely. Greater responsibility, more pressure, and new risks. But he also remembered the looks in Lisa Grace and Tommy's eyes as they stood by him. He remembered what Lily had said that morning, and he remembered something even deeper. He had fallen, but he had always gotten back up. A voice rang out beside him, "Uncle Elijah." He turned around. It was Zoe, Lily's classmate. Elijah chuckled softly. "Hi, Zoe. Where are you going?" "I was looking for Dad, but I saw you sitting here alone." "You look a little sad," Elijah chuckled. "You're very perceptive." Zoe sat down next to him. "My father said, good people get sad when they worry about others." Elijah looked at the little girl, feeling as if those simple words had touched a soft spot in his heart. "I think so too," he replied softly. Zoe stood up, and before leaving, she looked at him for a long time and said, "Don't be sad anymore, Uncle. Lily always drew you as a hero." Elijah froze. "A hero, yes. My dad said that a hero isn't the strongest person, but the one who remains kind after being hurt." The little girl smiled and then ran off. Elijah watched, and his heart suddenly felt lighter. Perhaps this is the answer he needed. That night, while Lily slept, Elijah sat at his desk. The desk lamp cast a shadow on his face, half light, half shadow, much like the jumbled thoughts swirling in his mind. He opened his laptop. The file Harold had given him today was still there. The words "Store Manager Offer Letter" stood out on the first page. Elijah took a deep breath. He was no longer trembling, no longer afraid. He felt peaceful. That's a sign he's ready. He closed his laptop, stood up, and walked to the window. Outside, a few raindrops fell occasionally like gentle tapping sounds. Elijah switched on the porch light, casting a soft, warm glow. He whispered, "I'm not going to run anymore." In the darkness, his face took on a determined expression, not that of a failed CEO, but that of a father, a man who had rediscovered his reason to stand up again. Tomorrow, he will accept Harold's offer. Tomorrow, Elijah Warren will return to the path he once lost. And tomorrow is a new beginning. A well-deserved start. The following morning, Cresthill was bathed in unusually beautiful sunshine. The sun cast a soft golden glow over the rooftops and the trees still glistening with dew. The air was pleasantly cool enough to make one want to take a deep breath and feel that today was a good day. Elijah stood in front of the mirror adjusting his tie, not the expensive kind he wore at Horizon Tech. Just a simple, understated light gray tie, fitting his current personality, calm, strong, and unpretentious. Lily walked over to him, holding a sketchbook in her hand. "Daddy looks handsome today." Elijah laughed and bent down. "So, Lily, do you think Dad will do well today?" Lily nodded so vigorously that her little earrings jingled. "Dad does the best job in the world. I know that. And Mom knows it too." Elijah held the little girl in his arms. Just for a moment, but it was enough to ease much of the pain he had carried. Today he will officially take on his new position. Officially stepping into a life he once thought he would never have the chance to experience again. When Elijah arrived at Maple and Shore Café, the glass doors gleamed and sunlight illuminated the cafe's pale blue logo. But inside, the most beautiful thing was the joyful faces of everyone. Lisa ran over. "Elijah, you're finally back," she laughed, her eyes sparkling. Tommy poked his head out from the kitchen and waved. "Welcome, Mr. Ass new manager." Elijah couldn't help but smile. Not a smile of victory, but the smile of someone who had found their place. The office door swung open. Harold walked out, hands in his pockets, a gentle, proud smile on his face. "Elijah Warren," he said loudly, "welcome back. Not as an employee, but as the leader of this place." The staff in the restaurant applauded in unison. Some regulars also clapped along without understanding what was happening, only feeling the warmth spreading throughout the space. Harold gave Elijah a set of keys. The office key, the safe key, the keys to every door inside the shop, and the key to a new life. "You deserve this," Harold said, "and I believe you will lead the team in the right direction." Elijah received the keys with both hands. It feels heavy, because of the responsibility. It feels light, because this is the path he chose himself. It feels sacred, because this is not a reward, but the result of his perseverance and kindness. He looked around the cafe. Every face here had once been a part of the war he had just been through. Lisa, brave despite her fear. Grace, hurt but not defeated. Tommy, rediscovering his true self after years of silence. And Elijah knew he wasn't here just to manage a coffee shop. He is here to build a place where people are treated with the respect they deserve. After the official launch, Harold took Elijah to the back of the bar. "Elijah," he whispered, "there's one last thing I want you to know." Elijah frowned. "What's going on, sir?" Harold looked at him as if he were a close relative. "When you saved me from the rain that day, you didn't know who I was. You didn't know I was the owner of Maple and Shore. You just saw an old man in trouble." Elijah chuckled softly. "I was just doing the right thing." Harold placed his hand on his shoulder. "And that's what saved me from the apathy I'd been carrying for years. I used to only see profit processes numbers, but that night you reminded me that a business doesn't exist for revenue. It exists for people." Elijah fell silent. Harold continued, "You didn't just save me. You saved the entire system that I had inadvertently allowed to rot. And so, I want to say this, thank you, Elijah." Elijah was speechless. His chest felt constricted, not from pain but from a profound sense of appreciation. Harold held out his hand. Elijah grabbed it. It wasn't just a handshake. It was a promise, a trust, a beginning. That afternoon, when the bar was once again bustling with customers, Elijah stood behind the counter watching Lisa chatting and laughing with customers, and Tommy comfortably instructing the new staff. There were no more shouts, no more fearful glances, only peace remains. And in that moment, Elijah felt happy. Grace walked over to him. "Elijah, thank you for everything." He laughed. "Grace, if you hadn't stood up, this wouldn't have gone anywhere." Grace smiled sadly but with relief. "But you're the one who made me dare to stand up." Elijah looked out the window where the afternoon sun cast a warm, golden light. "We all stood up. And that's what matters." Grace placed her hand on the counter and whispered, "And what about Caleb? He won't bother us anymore, will he?" Elijah tilted his head, his voice calm. "He will be investigated. But the important thing is that we are no longer afraid." Grace nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. That evening, Elijah picked Lily up from Marcy's house. She ran and ran into his arms. "Daddy, what are you doing today?" Elijah picked up his daughter and spun her around gently. "Today, Dad is starting over." Lily's eyes widened. "Is it like repainting a bad picture, Dad?" Elijah burst out laughing. "Yes, exactly the same. So, is your dad a good painter?" Elijah looked at the little girl, his heart softening. "I think I just painted the most beautiful picture of my life." Night fell over Cresthill. A thin moon hung against a deep purple sky. A gentle breeze rustled the trees in front of Elijah's house. He stood leaning against the door, gazing at the small town where he and Lily had struggled through so many ups and downs. From this humble home, he had relearned how to get back on his feet, how to believe in himself, and how to love without fear of being hurt again. And most importantly, he learned to forgive himself for past failures. There is no longer bitterness in his heart. No more fear. No more feeling insignificant in the face of life. There was only a strange peace, a new hope, a new path. Elijah gently placed his hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat become steady and strong. Life, no matter how many times it has knocked him down, today it has given him back what he rightfully deserves. He went back inside, gently closing the door behind him. Warm light streamed down onto the wooden floor. Lily was coloring. She looked up and smiled. "Daddy, will you draw with me?" Elijah smiled. "Yes, Dad always draws with me." And so the father and son sat together, peaceful, simple, yet so complete that all the previous events became like pages of a book that had been closed. A cycle of suffering has ended. A journey of healing has begun. That was the day Elijah Warren, a single father who had lost everything, found himself again. And from then on, Maple and Shore Café became a place where everyone who walked in felt one thing: kindness is powerful. And sometimes, just one act of kindness can change a life. If you believe that a story of kindness can touch a heart, please share Elijah's journey so that more people can be inspired. The following stories will hold even more surprises, emotions, and beautiful messages that you won't want to miss.